The Stars of Home, an EverQuest Next short story by Maxwell Alexander Drake, read by Edward LaCour. Misdirection. Smoke rose between Calistan's shoulders from where his head had been a moment before. His body stood like a tower of defiance, unwilling to acknowledge the fact that he was dead. Then the stocky dwarf pitched backward, landing on the marble-tiled floor with a heavy thud. Pity, he was handy with a spell. The elf's whisper echoed in the small chamber. Pity! Rasterman spun on the elf standing in the shadows. Pity! He was my brother, you callous, pointy-eared bastard! Turning back to Calistan's corpse, Rasterman's lower lip quivered as he knelt beside the body. The magical bolt of energy from the trap in the room had disintegrated his brother's head and most of his neck, leaving behind a blackened, cauterized scab in their place. At least your passing was quick. Rasterman placed his thick hand upon Calistan's unmoving chest. May Brel temper your spirit, brother. We cannot dally here. The snide tone of the elf made the hairs on the back of Rasterman's neck stand on end. Rage flooded down his spine. Without taking his eyes from his brother, he spoke through gritted teeth. If you say another word, elf, I swear it will be your last. Ha! You are not stupid enough to try. If you were, I would not have hired you for this job. Rastimund rose and looked at Quintus as if for the first time. If the elf was remarkable at all, it was in the fact that he was outstandingly average-looking. As a dwarf, Rastimund had always found it hard to distinguish one elf from another. However, there was something less to Quintus. Sure, he was tall, skinny, fair-skinned and blonde-haired, the typical elf. But it was his features that stood out, or didn't stand out might be more accurate. Rastimund was sure he had seen the elf's nose on a dozen other elves. His facial structure, the way he carried himself, his entire demeanour, they all looked as if they were borrowed from someone else. Many someone else's even. It almost seemed as if someone had carefully crafted Quintus's appearance to make anyone looking at him forget the details they saw. At the prolonged stare from Rastimund, Quintus narrowed his eyes and inclined his head slightly. My condolences over your loss. The elf's voice held no sincerity. But how long do you think we can stand outside the vault of a royal treasury before guards rush in with swords and spears and proceed to make us as dead as your brother? Rastimund stood his ground, contemplating pulling the hammer from his hip and beating the sarcastic look off the elf's face. Not that he thought he could succeed. He hated to admit it, even to himself, but Quintus terrified him. He could not say why. It was one more mystery to add to the long list of mysteries that had nagged Rastimund since the elf had shown up on his doorstep. The frown on Quintus's face deepened into a scowl. You are trying my patience, dwarf. With a glance back at his brother's body, Rastimund pointed a gnarled finger at the elf. This is not over between you and I, you reed-thin whelp. Stepping to the large oval door, Rastimund leaned in and took a closer look at the lock. Intricate did not begin to describe the complexity of the device. 2 keyholes, about 4 inches apart, stared back at him from the middle of a round centre plate. A massive golden gear ran around the plate. By the knob attached to it, it was obvious this gear was meant to be rotated as the final mechanism that opened the door. Both locks seemed to be standard pin and tumbler cylindrical devices, but he knew looks could be deceiving. These 2 keyways were the smallest he had ever come across in all his years as a burglar. He doubted there was a dwarf on Amaryl who could make devices so tiny. Without taking his eyes from the locks, he pulled out his picks. "We may be in a bad way here." "What do you mean?" Rasterman jumped. He had not heard Quintus approach and glared at the elf over his shoulder. "I think I can manage each of these, but it is not meant to be opened by one individual." He returned his attention to the door. "I think 3 is needed." "Well, we have but 2. That will have to suffice." Quintus stepped up to Rasterman. "I have come too far to fail now." "We shall not be failing here," Rasterman shook his head. "Not when success means I will be able to gaze upon the stars of my home once more." Opening his pick pouch, he withdrew his thinnest diamond-tipped pick. Flipping it over so the tip pointed down, he slid the pick all the way into the left lock till it hit the back. Pulling it out slowly, he listened as each tumbler fell back into place. 6 pins. He repeated the process on the other lock and found it was the same. He pulled out 2 tension bars and hooked each to the top of the keyways. "Here," he indicated to the thin metal bars. "We will need to hold these and apply tension to each." The elf reached out and took a tension bar in each hand, wrenching them to the side. All Rasterman could do was close his eyes and shake his head. "This will never work." "You turned them too hard, you ham-fisted oaf!" Rasterman grabbed the elf's hands before the fool could break the tension bars. The elf's hands felt odd to the touch, but Rasterman's mind was too focused on defeating the locks to worry with the why. "It takes a gentle touch, just enough tension to allow them to move when they are able." The elf released some tension from the bars. "Like this?" "Aye, just enough to keep 'em taut." Rasterman locked eyes with Quintus. "You are going to have to hold both with one hand. You'll be needing to rotate the gear with the other when the time is right." The elf stared down at the mechanism. Finally, he repositioned himself so that one of his hands held the 2 tension bars in one place, while the other rested on the handle of the gear. Rasterman withdrew a second thin pick from his pouch. He put one, then the other into the keyways of the 2 locks. He stretched out the index finger of each hand and rested them on the side of the tension bars the elf held. "You still be holding them too tight. Relax. I need to feel when each pin breaks free." Starting with the deepest, Rasterman began working at the tumblers. He let each of his hands work independently, trusting in his index fingers to pick up the vibrations as each pin reached its shear line. The work was taxing, and before long sweat was dripping down his nose. One by one, each tumbler fell into position. As they did, he nodded to Quintus to rotate the gear a notch further. When he had but 1 pin left on each lock, he looked up at Quintus. "These must be turned at the same time. Whichever one breaks free first, just hold it. Once I get the second one, I will turn the locks and you can rotate the gear." At a nod from the elf, Rasterman moved his attention back to his picks. The lock on the right came free first, and he was forced to grab the elf's hand to stop the idiot from turning the defeated device. It took just a few moments more for the second to pop. Slipping his 2 picks between his teeth, he reached out and grabbed the tension bars. "On the count of 3, Quintus nodded. 1, 2. Rasterman's heart jumped even as the elf began turning the gear prematurely. He tried to spin both locks in an attempt to catch up so that all 3 rotated simultaneously. He heard the latch on the inside of the door click. At the same time, a thin blade hidden on the inside rim of the gear whipped across the locking mechanism, snatching his hand away, a cold numbness cascading up his left arm. 4 meaty chunks squelched onto the floor. Looking down in horror, Rasterman watched blood spurt from stubs where his fingers were supposed to be. It took his mind a moment to grasp what he saw. Then agony bit down. With a gasp, he cradled his ruined left hand, trying to stem the flow of blood. You careless, incompetent fool! Look what you've done! Quintus simply pushed the dwarf aside and pulled the vault door open. The vision lying before Rastamund washed away all thoughts of pain. He took a tentative step forward, his mouth gaping. The chamber beyond held more wealth than he had ever dreamed. Beautifully crafted objects sat on shelves between bars of gold, silver, and platinum. Chests, bags, and sacks lay everywhere, filled with the seraphs only knew what. Statues of exquisite artisanship rested neatly against the far wall. Vases, frames, and small pieces of gilded furniture filled every open space. Even a small portion of what he saw would set his family up for generations. Still clutching his injured hand, he stumbled after the elf and entered the vault. Without a pause, Quintus headed for a small pedestal sitting in the back right corner. Take what you want. I would not linger long, though. The elf's words snapped Rastamund back to reality. Fishing a thick cloth rag from a side pocket of his coat, he bound it tightly around his hand. What? Quintus picked up a small sandstone rock from the pedestal. Outside of some runes etched across its surface, the stone did not appear to hold any value. I'm surprised the guards haven't discovered this yet. If you want to live, I recommend you don't let greed overshadow your common sense. Holding the small rock before him, Quintus let it go. Instead of falling to the floor, the rune-covered rock floated between the elf's hands. His face twisted with a mix of concentration and strain. Tendrils of light slithered from the tips of the elf's fingers, boring their way into different points along the stone. Where each tether of light touched a rune, it began to glow. Then, slowly, as if the marks themselves were trying to resist the change, each rune shifted into a new pattern. With each rewritten rune, the light emitted from the stone grew more intense. Before long, tears streamed from Rastamund's eyes with the strain of keeping the elf in his sight. The light grew so bright it began to play tricks on his eyes, making it seem as if the elf was changing along with the runes. One moment it was Quintus standing there, sweat tracing rivulets down his face while he weaved his magic on the stone. The next it was some shapeless wraith. A twisting serpentine image replaced that. Then it was Rastamund's dead brother, Khalistan, glaring at him, mouthing words of warning. Finally, it was too much, and Rastamund tore his eyes away, blinking to clear the tears from his vision. When he looked back, the vault was dim once more. Quintus stood grinning at the stone he held out before him. Rastamund found his throat dry and was forced to clear it before he could speak. What did you do? That stone'd better still open the portal. Quintus flashed a smile. Oh, it will work. Without further explanation, the elf slipped the stone into a pouch, turned and headed out the vault. We can't just leave all this gold. Rastamund reached out and tried to grab a stack of 5 gold bars. They did not move. He shifted his hands to the top one and lifted it. It was heavy, well over 30 pounds by itself. With one hand he awkwardly slipped it into his backpack and then grabbed another. A clang of metal on stone echoed from outside, caused him to flinch. With a grunt, he turned and followed the elf, cradling the second gold bar in the crook of his arm. Rastamund struggled with getting the gold into his pack as he shuffled down the service hall his small party used to get into the vault. It was not until he neared the trap door leading to the sewers that he realized he had not even glanced at his brother's corpse in passing. He looked over his shoulder back towards the vault room. Goodbye, my brother. May the forge find you pure. Reaching down, Rastamund lifted the crate set to the side of the corridor. The elf was long gone, and only a deserted ladder greeted him. He stuffed his left hand into his armpit and worked his way down, nearly falling twice. Jumping from the last rung, his boots sank into the revolting muck that flowed slowly down the centre of the sewer. The blood loss already had him light-headed. The foul stench of the place only enhanced his queasiness. "Quintus!" His whisper echoed down the dank tunnel. "You best be waiting for my wife and me at the portal." No reply came. "That damned elf had better keep his word. If he lied to me, there will not be a hole in this stinking, miserable world he can crawl into where I won't find him." After an hour of stumbling through the streets of Takish-Hiz, Rastamund's house came into view. A jagged pain ripped through his hand so fierce he contemplated hacking the arm completely off. The rag he had wrapped around it was soaked crimson red, heavy with dark globs of congealed blood. He staggered up his stoop, slamming through his front door and falling into a heap on the floor. Maritha appeared over him. She looked terrified. "Rastamund, what happened?" All he could do was smile up at her. "We be going home, my love." She cupped his forehead, a frown creasing her face. "You are home, my husband, and running a fever." She helped him rise before she noticed his hand and let out a gasp. "By the seraphs!" She pulled him into the kitchen and sat him at the table. "Who did this to you? We should call the guards." As she unwrapped the rag, sadness filled Rastamund at the sight of 4 bloody stumps where his fingers had been. "It doesn't matter." Tears rolled down his face. "Nothing else matters, my love. We are going home." "You're delirious." Reaching out, she grabbed his head between her hands and looked first into one of his eyes and then the other. "And you're scaring me. This is our home. You're sitting in our kitchen." Rising, she grabbed a basin and filled it with fresh water. Adding in a towel, she set to work cleaning his hand. "No." Rastamund shook his head and the room spun for a second. "Not this home. We are going home to Akashidak. I've arranged it." This last gave her pause and she looked up. "What do you mean?" "Home, my love, our true home. It was our forefathers who settled the wilds of Akashidak. We founded the great city of Moradim. We can go back. We can be free." With his right hand he grabbed the towel from her and rewrapped his hand. "Hurry! There is little time." He stood and pulled her towards the front of the house. She stopped before they reached the door, pulling her hand from his. "We cannot leave. What are you saying?" "Akashidak may have been where you were born, but none of my family is from there. Besides, if we are going somewhere, I have to pack." "Leave it. Leave it all. We will buy what we need once we get to Akashidak." He bounced, feeling the weight of the 2 gold bars in his pack. "I will buy you everything you have ever wanted." Reaching out, he took her hand once more. "Come, there's no time." As they worked their way through the crowded streets of Takish-Hiz, Rastamund began to worry. What if we don't get to the portal in time? What if that brain-rattled elf uses it before we arrive? They would only get one chance to trigger the portal before the Dal guards descended upon them. He wished he could have told more of his people. He didn't know of a single dwarf who did not long to escape the slavery the elves held them under. Though they dreamed of freeing Khaladim, he was sure even those who hadn't been born on Akashidak would welcome the chance to gather their strength there. "What of my family? What of your brother?" Barathar's words added weight to his inner thoughts. turning them painful. He looked at her, knowing she could see the grief filling his eyes, and shook his head. "I'm sorry, my love. There just be no time. The portal will open, but for a moment we must be there when it does." Beritha's face filled with fear and anguish as the reality of what he had said washed over her. She raised her hand to cover her mouth. "Oh, Rastimund, what have you done?" He stopped in the middle of the crowded street, merchants and guards, farmers and craftsmen, every race and every class of people streaming past them. But he could not bear seeing his wife this way. He could not continue if she was in turmoil. Besides, they were almost to the portal. Reaching out, he placed his good hand upon her rosy cheek and spoke in a hushed whisper. "Everything will be fine, my love. I helped liberate the stone that opens the portal. It's what will take us home." Her eyes grew big and she shook her head from side to side. "You said you were through with that. You said no more burglary." "It was not burglary, my love." He tried to smile at her the best he could. The pain in his hand and the panic filling his mind over them missing the portal made it difficult. "The Dahl have no right to lock the stone away, to trap us here and enslave us. All I did was—" The ground lurched, not a tremor as with an earthquake. It was as if the entire world had been violently jerked to the side. People and animals were knocked from their feet. Rastimund froze, uncertain whether what they had just experienced had happened at all. Time stretched. It seemed as if all of Norath held its collective breath. Sound became muffled, drained from the world like water over a fall. Pressure built within Rastimund's ears to the point of pain, and he raised his hands to cover them. Locking eyes with Beritha, he knew the same plagued her as well. Looking past her shoulder, he saw an elven woman screaming not 10 feet away, her neck muscles straining as she shrieked, but all was silent. With a loud whoosh of air, the ground lurched back and all sound came rushing back at once. Several people still on their feet were thrown about like rag dolls. A building to Rastimund's right, a large 3-story wood-framed inn, groaned as it rocked back and forth. The shifting of the ground had caused the building to lean, though not collapse. Within seconds, people poured from it in a mad dash to safety. A human standing between Rastimund and the leaning inn raised his hands. "What's happening? What is that noise?" A tingling metallic taste coated Rastimund's tongue, as if he had been sucking on a piece of silver. Looking back on his Beritha, he shrugged. "I don't—" The ground rumbled. Then came the violent, thunderous sound of boulders crashing through a mountainside. In an instant, panic struck. People ran in every direction. The leaning building pitched further to the side, and the sounds of splintering wood reverberated through the streets as it crashed down away from where Rastimund and his wife stood. He pulled Beritha in close, hugging her to his body as they were jostled around by the masses bolting past. She wailed. He could feel her trembling, even through the non-stop shaking of the earth. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. People continued to run, continued to scream, but Rastimund paid them no mind. "Are you all right, my love?" He ran his hand over her head, flattening some stray hairs. Beritha looked terrified, but she nodded her head. What was that? Glancing around, he shrugged again. "Just an earthquake." Most of the buildings in this area still stood, though destruction lay everywhere. The inn was little more than a pile of splintered beams and broken boards, smoke billowing from several sections. He could hear the muffled moans of those still alive and trapped inside. It would be their tomb. In an instant, darkness covered the area. A woman screamed, a blood-curdling sound that pulled all eyes to her. One of her hands covered her mouth, and the other pointed to the sky. Rastimund looked up. Where sky and sun hung just a second before, a massive object the size of half the city fell from the sky directly above them. He stood dumbfounded. Where had it come from? He did not know. People ran, but he did not see the point. There was no way anyone would escape. He stared up at his own death racing towards them, clutching his wife. Then, as if it were never there, the slab of earth disappeared in a clap of thunder. Rastamund and his wife were buffeted by the winds rushing up to fill the vacated spot. "Tell me you had nothing to do with this." Terror laced Beritha's voice and tears streamed down her face. He looked at her. How could she even think that? "No, all I did was..." His eyes flew wide open. "The stone, the change Quintus did, surely it could not be the cause of this." Turning, he ran toward where the portal stood as fast as his legs could go, dragging Beritha in his wake. The streets were clogged, but he did not care. He weaved around all he could, bowling his way through what he could not. The ground began to tremble once more, starting as a weak vibration. It built in intensity as they ran. The entire city yelled out in a cacophony of anguish. By the time they reached the merchant district, the ground shook violently, and it was all Rastamund could do to remain on his feet as they moved. "We have to keep going. We must reach the portal before it closes." As they ran past the forge, it exploded, not with fire, but with earth. 1 minute it was there, the next a sandy hill filled the space where it had been. Brush and briars covered the hill at odd angles. Something tickled his memory, but in the chaos he could not concentrate long enough to figure out why. Dirt and debris rained down upon everyone in the area. Rastamund did not stop. He could not stop. They were so close to the portal, so close to escaping. Rounding the corner of the last building, the portal came into view. In the center of the immense open promenade, 4 giant carved monoliths reached up to the sky. Rastamund had been here many times, had seen the portal activated even. But what he had witnessed brought him up short. The portal fluctuated, opening and closing in a mad, chaotic flurry, each time sending out a ripple of energy that crashed into everything around. Buildings shook with each wave, bodies hurled through the air, and the noise. Had Rastamund stuck his head in a mighty bell as it tolled, he doubted it would compare. With each pulse of the portal, reality shifted. Everything changed. What he saw, what he felt, even the taste on his tongue. One moment the bitter flavor of lime assailed his mouth, the next the sweetness of honey. Then his heart froze. There, standing at the base of the portal, stood Quintus. The elf's back was turned to the portal, his arms raised, and he was laughing. Laughing. Even as debris rained down upon him, the elf seemed to be in ecstasy. He was shouting, though over the din Rastamund could not hear what. The air around Quintus shimmered, as if light bathed the elf. Then the visage of Quintus shifted again, the same trick of light Rastamund witnessed back in the vault. Quintus seemed to flip from one form to another like a deck of cards. Elf, human, spectre, ogre, dwarf, serpent, gnoll, orc. Which was the true form? Which the illusion? Was he none of them, or all of them? Through the shouting and the din all around them, Rastamund caught a few of the words Quintus shouted. "It begins! The new age begins!" The portal behind the creature throbbed once more, belching out tendrils of energy. One struck Quintus in the back, and he exploded in a spray of blood and gore. Though Rastamund could not recognize the bits of flesh that fell to the ground, he knew they weren't from an elf. Before Rastamund could grasp what he had just witnessed, the ground swelled, and a piece of land burst through the cobblestones forming the promenade. The force of the explosion knocked Rastamund off his feet. Beritha shrieked as her grip ripped from his. He struggled to regain his footing, to reach his wife. She still stood, looking around in open horror, pointing back to another hill that had appeared out of thin air. Her mouth hung open. He could not take the time to care. They had to get through that portal, whatever is happening here. We must escape to Akashidak. He stumbled forward, trying to reach Baritha. The ground lurched as she staggered, fell. The rolling earth drove him to his hands and knees as well. He crawled. He had to reach her. She was screaming. She needed him. He grabbed her hand and tried to pull her to him, to comfort her, but she would not budge. Looking past her, he could not believe what he saw. Where the lower half of her body should be, there was only stone. A tower, one of dwarf make, rose up behind her. Through her! It had not been there a moment before, could not have been there, for the Dahl had long since banned all dwarven architecture within the city. Debris rolled down the tower's side, the building next to it crumbled into a pile of rubble. But his Baritha, she was there, alive inside the rock, blood pouring from her lips. Her eyes rolled back in her head. By the Serifs, no! He scooted closer, holding her tight. She jerked in his grasp, then fell limp. No! More boulders, trees and hills appeared around them, some remaining untouched. Others seemed to bend and twist, as if melted by some unseen force. Others blinked away moments after they appeared. He did not care. He could not care. He held his wife to his chest and sobbed. Gale-force winds rushed one way, then reversed course in the blink of an eye. His tear-blurred gaze fell back onto the hill that had erupted from under the promenade, onto the broken trees still standing on the hill. That cannot be! The splintered fragments of stone fruit trees covered the hillside. He could see the big grey fruits hanging from their branches. But stone fruit trees only grow on Akashidak, not here on Norath. More terrain popped into existence all around him, only to vanish an instant later, each one covered in plants he recalled from his youth. The rumbling increased in intensity until he bounced across the ground like a child's ball. Nothing stood any longer. Destruction surrounded him. All of it could burn in the forge for all he cared. He held the only thing that mattered. The only thing that kept him alive all these long years. He ran his hands through Baritha's reddish-brown hair before pressing his lips to her forehead. Blood splattered his face as a horse was ripped in half, or more accurately, when half of the horse disappeared, leaving a chunk of flesh with two back legs kicking. A rending sound split through the clamour around him, so loud it slashed at his ears. A jagged streak of black arched across the heavens. The line tore open, peeling back the bright blue of the sunlit sky to reveal a deep darkness Rastamund had not seen since his childhood. The night sky of Akashidak. Tears welled up and poured down his cheeks. He did not know how, but he knew those were the stars of his home, shining down upon him and his wife. Look, my love, you can see the stars of our true home, of Akashidak. A moment later the stars were gone, replaced by a swirling storm of light that surged outward from the portal to erase everything around him. The ground on either side of the portal split, and a jagged stripe of blinding light filled the chasm left behind. As the rift in the earth grew, so too did the light, until all that filled Rastamund's vision was a glowing whiteness. A howling rush of air tore over him, and his skin boiled. His mind screamed out in agony as his world split in two, ripping the last bit of life from his body.